The hero of Lovecraftian horror pieces together disassociated information and uncovers some tentacle-waving eldritch abomination. I placed two seemingly unrelated books next to each other on my bookshelf, and here I am. I say seemingly unrelated because we wouldn't imagine there would be very much common ground between the cosmic horror fiction of H.P. Lovecraft and the existential philosophy of Jewish theologian Martin Buber. But, considered in the proper light, there's a surprising connection between these two very different shades of genius. So just as the hero of Lovecraftian horror puts together this disassociated information, this paper will attempt to assemble disparate strands of philosophy to reveal a new means of approaching cosmic horror fiction. This new critical method shall interpret the weird tale as a horrific inversion of the metaphysical dialogue described by Buber, but one which proceeds according to the same principles of relation. And in order to do that, I've taken Lovecraft's most famous short story, The Call of Cthulhu, which these two fine gentlemen have already done a good job of awakening in your hearts, and read that through the lens of Martin Buber's I and Thou. I'm assuming that anybody who's wandered into the NecronomiCon already has read or is at least familiar with The Call of Cthulhu, but Martin Buber might not have the same overlapping audience, so I'm just going to do a quick summary, nutshell summary of Buber's philosophy. Buber was an existentialist and also a Hasidic Jew. So that interesting overlap leads him to, on the existentialist terms, reject Hegelian rationalism and focus on the individual, but also, through the Hasidic influence, believe in meeting God through the created world. So he understands human life as taking place between two subjects. That's essentially the dialogue of ontology. It's this dialectical structure in which two subjects approach each other and meaning comes out of it. And there are two types of relation that human beings can build. One is the I-it relation, which is objectifying. That's the impersonal, experiential, usable relation, in which a given subject, the I, dominates a given object, the it, the he, or the she. And that's important for performing impersonal work like science or politics or business, but Buber decides conclusively that we can't form our whole existence based on objectifying relationships because we can't say the word it with the whole of our being, and therefore anybody who can only say it is not a real human being. They're only a part of a human being. Buber has his famous quote, "Without it, man cannot live, but he who lives with it alone is not a man." And so that leads us to the second relation, which is the I-thou relation, which is one in which two subjects approach each other in a mutually affecting, equally subjective relationship. It can only be spoken with the whole being, so you're a full subject when you use the I-thou relationship. And the ultimate thou, the eternal thou, is to Buber God. That's the thou in whom all lines of relation meet. So every time we say thou, or address somebody as a subject, we're recognizing in turn the eternal thou, which is the sum total of all thous, essentially. So the chief goal of this paper is to demonstrate that the sense of cosmic horror expressed in the Call of Cthulhu is successful because it reflects a diseased worldview back upon itself. It forces an objectifying materialist to self-objectify and take an unwilling stand in relation to an indomitable and incomprehensible thou figure. Cthulhu and the Great Old Ones are perverted manifestations of Buber's eternal thou. Cthulhu also fulfills Buber's description of the demonic thou. He is a creature which all ordinary men must perforce recognize as a subject, but who responds to them, if at all, as mere objects. This establishes the fundamental relation of Lovecraft's cosmic dread, which operates as a grotesque parody of the cosmic love that Buber envisions as taking place between a human and a divine subject. The link between human and elder god is neither I-it, objectifying, nor I-thou, personal and meaningful, but the uniquely Lovecraftian idea of it-thou. It is a relation in which one participant is consciously stripped of his subjectivity by an all-consuming thou. Therefore, the strain of literary cosmicism that Lovecraft expresses in the Call of Cthulhu is not merely the nihilistic fear of meaninglessness in an empty universe. It is rather the fear of a nihilist confronting the shockingly full universe and grappling with an awful, awesome meaning that involves but does not include him. So that's the main contention of my paper. I'm now going to try to defend that as best I can. If I run out of time, you can hunt me down after the panel and fight me to the death if that would satisfy you. So the first issue I think we run into is that I just described Francis Wayland Thurston as a nihilist. which sounds like too strong a word for him. In fact, I think character might be too strong a word for Francis Wayland Thurston. He gives us absolutely no insight into his personality. He has a few peripheral references to being his ingrained skepticism or his callous rationalism, but he does very little to convince us that he's a human being. As a matter of fact, the only time we see his name is in a very impersonal obituarial subtitle explaining where the paper was found. Buber would say that this is the natural state of the materialist, objectifying I of the I-it relation. A meaningful personal identity develops through our ability to say thou, develops through our relations. I become through my relation with the thou. As I become I say thou. Thurston has no real story of his own. Everything important that he talks about are the actions of other people, be they Inspector Legrasse, or Gustav Johansen, or Professor Angel. Great Cthulhu has tentacles that anchor him to meaning. Thurston, by comparison, is a hollow ghost floating over the pages of his own story. His eye is so weak that at the end of the story, his sense of self is irrevocably blasted by the forced saying of thou to an entity meant through simple conjecture rather than actual lived experience. Yes. Now, Buber identifies that the materialist objectifying I, the I-it relation, has to form a sort of cognitive dissonance to protect himself from meaninglessness, and that's pretty well exemplified in Thurston. Thurston recognizes the world as being comprised of nothing but objects, but continues to tacitly assume that he, who is in the world, is perfectly valid as a subject. He does not seem to consider any vast meaning to the world, but is paradoxically enthusiastic about the importance of his own research. Thurston, therefore, has two rival conceptions of the world. His conscious, philosophical self believes in a purely material universe, whereas subjective meaning is largely irrelevant, whereas his subjective, personal self clings desperately to the belief that his own subjectivity is genuinely important. But a time comes, Buber says, when the shuddering man looks up and sees both images in a flash together, and then a deeper shudder seizes him, which ought to immediately bring to mind the famous opening lines of Call of Cthulhu. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents. In the Call of Cthulhu, the shudder is very deep indeed. It's not merely the unpleasantness of having to discard one image or the other, but the supreme dread of seeing the images reversed. Thurston discovers that his active self, his personal, self-identified core, is utterly worthless, but his existence, along with the existence of the cosmos itself, which he was so apt to write off as objects, are actually pregnant with a deeply nauseous meaning. Buber says that the objectifying... So the terror that seizes Thurston is therefore not simply the nihilistic fear of becoming an object among other objects, but the distinctly and disturbingly religious fear of becoming an object before a malevolent perversion of the eternal thou. Cthulhu is definitely not what Buber had in mind when he described the eternal thou. By the same turn, however, God is also not the model that Lovecraft was working with when he created his alien menace. Lovecraft is very vocal in his insistence that Cthulhu and the Great Old Ones were extraterrestrial creatures that were not divine or supernatural in any form. But whatever the respective authors' intentions, Cthulhu effectively functions as a variation on the eternal thou. From a simple human point of view, Cthulhu bears all of the divine characteristics of the thou. He is completely incomprehensible to the feeble mind of man. He seems limitlessly powerful before all futile human efforts, and he reaches out to dreamers in the night so that when the world of man is silent, it hears the voice of the daemon say, thou. That's a quote from Buber. In other words, Cthulhu functions as a god because he must be addressed as thou by all humans unfortunate enough to regard him. His prodigious strength will not permit him to be dominated, his vast incomprehensibility prevents him from being objectified, and his role in the overwhelming destiny of the universe will not allow him to be ignored. As to the eternality of Cthulhu as thou, one only needs to read the most discussed couplet of NecronomiCon, that is not dead, which can eternal lie. So both Cthulhu and the eternal thou share in material causality, but exist outside of its physical and temporal conventions. Cthulhu is in our world, but he is not a part of it. He has shape, but the shape was not of matter, so that he can plunge from world to world through the sky. He doesn't merely disregard the laws of geometry and time, but observes them in a frighteningly alternative fashion. He dreams away nameless eternities in non-Euclidean corpse city. I made sure to wear my non-Euclidean tie today. Whose very ankles can swallow men whole. Similarly, Buber tells us that the thou appears, to be sure, in space, but in the exclusive situation of what is over against it, where everything else can only be the background out of which it emerges, not its boundary and measured limit. It appears too in time, but of that in the event which is fulfilled in itself. Cthulhu, by his very nature, shatters the human understanding of the material I-it relation and leaves nothing but himself and instead. We can never call Cthulhu it. We've heard both of our linguists over here tell us, talk about Johansson's use of thing to describe Cthulhu. The thing cannot be described. There's no language for such abysms of shrieking and immoral lunacy. The thou cannot be contained within the narrow confines of human language. And this ties directly into a quote from Buber, that we speak the primary word thou with our being, but can hardly utter it with our lips. And when we talk, when we speak with the thou, our words cling to the very threshold of speech. And if the guttural, barely pronounceable chant that the Cthulhu cultists use doesn't cling to the threshold of speech, then I don't know what does. But if, however, great Cthulhu were nothing more than the eternal thou with tentacles, Lovecraft's story would likely have a much more cheerful ending. What makes this a tale of cosmic dread, rather than a benign, if unusually cephalopodian, story of religious conversion, is that Cthulhu also fits Buber's conception of the demonic thou. We must, by virtue of his dread influence over us, address the alien god as thou, and he will never respond back to us except as objects. Rather than establishing a meaningful and loving relationship of mutual subjectivity, Cthulhu disposes of humans as objects in such a way that they are forced to recognize and despairingly accept their own objectification. So long as we know of the eldritch monstrosity that haunts the ocean floors, we must acknowledge the world and all that is in it, including our very selves, as objects that exist for him and his dreadful brethren, all of whom will arise when the stars are right, to claim us as their own. We discover the value of our life, or the lack thereof, in relation to Cthulhu, that he will by no means condescend to form a relation, or return relation with beings as pathetic as human creatures. The counterexample of this are the nightmares broadcast from Relay to the sensitives and cultists throughout the world, which almost seem like a form of relation, but I have an alternative theory to explain those. Quoting from Buber's description of the demonic thou, we find that the demonic thou, to which no one can become thou, is the elementary barrier of history, where the basic word of connection loses its reality. Toward him everything flames, but his fire is cold. To him 1,000 several relations lead, but from him none. He sees the beings around him indeed as machines, capable of various achievements which must be taken into account and utilized for his cause. Cthulhu doesn't engage in genuine relation building with the world of men, but he objectively manipulates certain sensitive human beings in order to accomplish his own dread desires. The cause for Cthulhu is obviously the worst charity in the world, it sounds like, but it's the resurrection of the great old ones and the ensuing reconquest of the globe. This can't be accomplished until the stars are in proper alignment, but it's also going to require some form of external assistance. At that time, says Lovecraft, some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserve them intact likewise prevent them from making an initial move. The dead god depends on the participation of humanity for his return to power, and his nightmarish interactions with individual humans are a campaign of manipulative influence rather than the forming of true relations. The dependence of Cthulhu on human assistance is a monstrous rendering of Buber's statement that God needs us for the very meaning of our lives. What the philosopher meant by that was that between the human and the divine, the dialogue between the human and the divine subject is what causes God to become God and allows us to be fully human. In the context of Lovecraft, however, it's true that the dialogue is what allows God to become God, in the sense that it's what allows Cthulhu to resurrect and take back over the world. But if we follow the rest of that, we're left with a truly awful pronouncement that the most human thing we can do is to serve this creature that wants nothing more than to devour us. Critics that consider Lovecraft's universe as a place where human life is meaningless and irrelevant are being far too merciful. Existential dread is best expressed when a character is forced to confront a meaning that excludes him, but requires his life for its operation. The fear of a life without value is nothing compared to the fear of a life with a value that cannot be redeemed by the living subject. This is the fear of final objectification, which Buber describes as the time when the continually growing world of it overruns a man and robs him of the reality of his own I, until the incubus over him and the ghost within him whisper to each other the secret of their non-salvation. I have some fun material on the cultists over here that I don't think we'll have time for. I'm just going to skip right ahead to... I have 1 minute left. By way of conclusion, we can consider Lovecraftian horror as a ghastly mirror image of an existential love, in order to understand why it operates on a cosmic rather than a personal level. The expressions of terror that we reviewed so far have mostly about the individual loss of meaning and identity. Yet, out of this felt experience of fear eventually arises the ontological condition of cosmic dread, just as emotional experiences with the thou ultimately lead us to a loving and cosmic union. Buber says that man dwells in his love. Love does not cling to the I in such a way as to have the thou only for its content, but love is between I and thou. In exactly the same way, ontological horror develops in the space between the conscious object, the human, and the overwhelming subject, Cthulhu. Once one takes a stand in relation to the Buber's eternal thou, everything within the world, and even the world itself, becomes charged with sacred meaning as a potential vessel of God. Once one takes a stand in relation to Cthulhu, however, one lives in perpetual anxiety of the twisted menace and suspense that lurks leeringly behind every corner of the world. Buber lives to meet the vast and mysterious grandeur flowing down to us through every facet of the loving universe. Lovecraft's narrator wishes to kill himself when he thinks of the extent of all that may be brooding down there. The essential exposition of cosmic dread, which I will conclude with, comes when Thurston tells us that he has looked upon all the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterward be poison to me, which is a perfect corruption of the Goethe epigram that begins I and thou. So waiting, I have one for you, the end, God's presence in each element.